let Elissa start talking, but I'm going to start the recording of the session. Elissa, are you?
Yes, I am here. Can you hear me okay? Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I can either see the presentation or I can monitor the chat. So I am going to step away from looking at the chat, but if you guys have questions that you want to drop in there while I'm talking, then I will try to get back to those at the end. So let's get started here. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about wildlife on the farm, aligning conservation, production, and human health goals. To start off, you might be wondering why I work in agricultural systems, and it's because agriculture is extensive. So at this point, about 40% of terrestrial land area is agriculture. So that's more than forests and more than protected areas. So I said ag is about 40%, protected areas are only about 15%. The same patterns are true in Wisconsin. So on the map on the left in green, you can see protected areas. And then on the right, the brown shade that's more on the bottom of the state is agriculture. So as you can see, there's way more agriculture than there are protected areas in Wisconsin, and that pattern is true globally. Today I'm going to be focusing on diversification practices. So diversified
Elissa,
farming
the
systems.
slides don't seem to be advancing for some reason. We're still seeing the title slide. The slides are not advancing. We are still seeing the title slide.
Oh,
there we go.
What a bummer. That must just be a delay. They are advancing for me. Are you still seeing the title slide?
No, I can see that you have left presenter mode.
Okay, let's try again. What slide do you see now?
We're still seeing your non-presenter slides. There must be an extraordinary video lag.
Okay, can you see me switching slides now?
No. I see the diversification can support biodiversity slide, but in non-presenter mode. Oh, title slide.
Hmm. Okay, what should I do about that?
Okay, I believe there's going to be a few minute delay here if Elissa logs out and then logs back in by a different computer or different, excuse me, different browser.
Okay, what are you guys seeing now?
Um, tiny little slide.
Tiny little slides.
Yeah.
Bill?
Yeah, it looks like the presenter mode slideshow.
But you're
Um,
seeing the presenter stuff, or you're not seeing big slides?
no, we're seeing small slides.
Yeah, we're seeing the
Um,
presenter mode, I think.
So strange. You said you had two screens, Elissa, is that right?
I did, I unplugged it. Now I'm just on my laptop.
Yeah. And escape the presentation. And your audio, it's possible your audio might work well this time. I don't know if you want to try that.
Okay, we can try that.
Okay, we can try that. I can switch over. When I share this way, I don't get to choose what I'm sharing.
By sharing the application, you mean, as opposed to sharing your entire screen?
Mm-hmm.
I think you could probably just run it on your entire screen, but I guess you might not be able to monitor the chats then, but
Yeah, the only thing that I can do is just say I want to share, and then I don't
and we
get a
lost
choice what I'm sharing. And then I can go.
Yeah, and this audio is garbled too. This audio stream is garbled.
Okay, let's switch back.
Okay, let's switch back.
I apologize, Alyssa. I haven't encountered these dramas before. So can you escape your presentation right now?
I can stop sharing.
I can stop sharing.
Uh, I meant get out of the presentation itself, but remain within PowerPoint. Could she email the person? Yeah, she can email it to me. She's got my email.
Okay, I will do that.
Okay, I will do that.
The other option is that I can send you guys a Zoom link, but I don't think we want to have everybody
I don't think
switch
we want
over.
to have everybody switch over.
Okay, so I'm waiting for that email. And let's hope the email is less glitchy than the.
All right. Wow. Thank you for getting that going. All right. So I think we got through the first couple of slides, and I will just sort of indicate if I'm ready to move on. So we know agriculture is extensive, and the same patterns that are true globally are also true in Wisconsin. Today I'm going to be focusing on diversified farming systems. So what are diversified farming systems? They're production systems that integrate crop and non-crop components on farms and in the surrounding landscapes. And in these systems, these kinds of practices can help to balance conservation and livelihood goals. So by planting multiple crop types and restoring vegetation in grass strips, hedgerows, or adjacent forest patches, growers can sustain biodiversity on their farms and enhance valuable ecosystem services, such as pest control, pollination, and soil fertility. Can move on to the picture of the farms. Yeah, one more. So these are two pictures of different strawberry farms. The farm on the left is a strawberry monoculture, and it supports fewer wild species than a diversified farm, which is surrounded by orchards, hedgerows, and different types of crops and natural habitats. You see the diversified farm on the right. So the monoculture landscape creates barriers to wildlife dispersal, whereas the diversified landscape is a lot more permeable. The concept of this agricultural matrix, or the space, the farm fields between the natural habitat, has its roots in island biogeography. So instead of thinking of actual islands with no habitat in between, we recognize that farms themselves provide habitat resources. Some farming practices can make it easier for species to move through the matrix. Next. Diversified farming practices also enhance ecosystem services. So one diversification practice that's gaining traction is the use of flower strips, or planted flowers within fields or at field edges. A recent meta-analysis found that flower strips enhanced pest control by 16%. But these effects are mediated through biodiversity. On the right, this infographic sums up a study in corn and soy rotations. So flower strips resulted in a 2 to 3-fold increase in insect and bird richness, pollinator, and bird abundance. They also reduced runoff by 37% and reduced erosion by 95%. So I've showed you that diversification can support biodiversity and enhance ecosystem services, which suggests that diversified farming systems represent a win-win for conservation and production goals. However, we need to take a closer look to really understand what's going on here. Next slide, please. The first question that we'll focus on is, how do local and landscape practices structure ecological communities? Next, we'll look at how local and landscape practices impact wildlife health. And then finally, which local and landscape practices are most likely to promote positive net effects from wildlife? Next slide. In this first section, we're going to be focusing on biodiversity conservation, or how practices structure ecological communities. This area of my research asks how we can best conserve biodiversity in dynamic human-modified environments. I'll primarily focus on bat biodiversity outcomes associated with different agricultural practices. Next slide. These two photos show coffee systems, which is one of the most well-studied agricultural systems, and a range of management types make it ideal for understanding the impacts of management on biodiversity. These photos are from Chiapas, Mexico, and on the left you see sun coffee, and on the right you see agroforestry. So traditional coffee systems are agroforestry, like on the right, and they involve growing coffee under a forest canopy. So they have more different kinds of trees, and more different kinds of epiphytes. The shade management intensification is also tends to use fewer agrochemicals. So this is the system where I first became interested in questions about diversification and biodiversity in 2007. I worked on a project looking at how differences in coffee management impacted bats. In the sun coffee systems, we saw a lot of these Jamaican fruit bats, whereas in the agroforestry systems, we saw some really cool species, like this wrinkle-faced bat, which has a super cool turtleneck that it can pull up over its face. So we noticed differences that were very clear in the communities. And this got me thinking about, well, we know that there are differences in the plant biodiversity between systems, right? We know that the shade coffee system has more kinds of trees. But what about differences in associated biodiversity? So which species are showing up in these different kinds of landscapes? Next slide. I used meta-analyses to assess changes in bat communities as a result of agricultural intensification. So we looked at differences between natural habitat and agricultural systems, such as between coffee and forest, or between a high intensity system and a low intensity system, like between sun and shade coffee. What we found was that intensification did not change bat abundance in agroforestry systems, but it did change abundance in systems without trees. So what we see here is agroforestry can mitigate the negative impacts of agriculture. And we saw the same trend for species richness, but it wasn't significant. Next slide. Many of the studies in our meta-analysis were from tropical systems in Latin America or temperate systems in Europe. So the, hard to see here because it's so tiny, but the red dots signify studies of agricultural management. And as you can see, they're really focused in Europe and in Latin America. So we really don't know much about what's going on with temperate bats in the US. The species in the US are completely different from the species that would be found in Europe. So this got me thinking about my doctoral research project, which focused on bats in California's Central Coast. Next slide, please. So I want to introduce you to the system where I've done most of my research. California's Central Coast is an economically and ecologically valuable area. Both large industrial monocultures and smaller diversified farms exist in this region, as well as semi-natural habitat like chaparral and woodlands, grasslands, and wetlands. Those are all interspersed between farms. Now, in the Central Coast, there's very fertile soil and a temperate climate, so it makes this region a hotspot for agriculture, which is why leasing irrigated cropland in the Central Coast is triple the price of anywhere else in the U.S. This encourages growers to use very intensive practices and produce high-value fruits and vegetables all year round. In intensive systems like I just showed you, natural habitat is also limited to riparian vegetation that can serve as wildlife corridors. So in the upper left, you can see a riparian corridor sort of weaving through the middle of the picture. However, remaining habitat has been cleared over food safety concerns. Next slide, please. Prominent outbreaks of foodborne illnesses, including a major outbreak of E. coli in bagged spinach in 2006, have been traced back to the Central Coast. In 2006, in this incident, the same E. coli strain implicated in the outbreak was traced to feral pigs and cattle and surface water, suggesting that wildlife and livestock might play a role in pathogen transmission. So in the lower left, you can see feral pigs. They are drinking out of a cattle water trough. So we know that there are interactions going on between livestock and feral pigs in this landscape. The idea that wildlife posed a threat to food safety was quickly incorporated into food safety frameworks and extended to all kinds of wildlife, such as birds. So the idea that if you've got any kind of natural vegetation like trees near your farm, you are inviting wildlife to come in, and they might defecate on the crop fields, and they might carry pathogens. So even though these practices were put into place, there was no evidence that this was going to actually reduce food safety risks. Next slide, please. So in an effort to reduce these risks, growers were pressured to remove habitat to exclude wildlife from farms. But this could jeopardize biodiversity and ecosystem services. On the left, you can see a map that shows what happened in the 3 years after this outbreak. The areas in red indicate areas where vegetation has been cleared, which is probably most apparent on the right side of the channel there. You can see some of those polygons outlined in orange and red. On the left have vegetation, on the right they no longer do. So within 3 years of this outbreak in the Salinas River Valley, 13% of remaining natural vegetation was removed. Even in recent years, growers feel pressure to remove habitat, and food safety standards may represent a conflict with conservation goals. The picture on the right is just from last summer, and it's a whole road lined with trees. These were eucalyptus trees that were all removed, and I can't say exactly why, but this pattern in the region indicates that growers were pressured to remove vegetation due to food safety concerns. So that's a little context about the system where I work, and now I'm going to go into a couple different studies in the system in the Central Coast, starting with bats and talking about how practices structure communities. Next slide, please. This is work from my dissertation where I investigated bats and vegetable systems. So remember, I said before, after that meta-analysis that we put together, we identified that this is really a research gap. We don't know what temperate bats in the U.S. are doing. Most of their research on U.S. bats in ag focuses on pest control and sort of monetizing their value or looking at the economic value of bats. So you'll get familiar with the Central Coast. There's a map on the left. You can see the Monterey Bay, and my study sites are scattered across the region. So I selected 18 landscapes across a diversification gradient. So across a gradient of areas that were intensive agriculture to areas where farms were embedded in more natural landscapes and had woodlands nearby. I also had 3 sites that I looked at together within a landscape. So I looked at what was going on in the woodland, and then a nearby organic farm and a conventional farm. I set up acoustic detectors, and I recorded over 36,000 bat calls, and we identified them each to species. In the lower right-hand corner, you can see a picture of a sonogram. So when you record bat calls, you can actually visualize the call, and the frequency and the shape of the call can help you identify which species produced it. So much like you might go out bird watching and hear songs and know which species are there, you can do the same thing with bats with the help of technology, because bats are echolocating mostly out of the human range of hearing. So in addition to collecting the bat calls, I also looked at management practices on the farms where we set up the detectors, as well as collected insects with blacklight traps. Next slide, please. We found that there were no differences in species richness between woodlands, organic, and conventional farms. But we did find that organic farms and woodlands have similar diversity. So there is some signal here that organic management could be beneficial for bats. On farms, the most common species was the Mexican free-tailed bat, which is adapted for flying in open spaces. It's this guy over here on the right. And then in woodlands, the most common species was Eumyotis, which is better adapted for flying through forests. So we didn't see really striking differences when we compared organic and conventional farms. So I decided to take a step back from that dichotomy of management practices and ask, could there be specific management practices that are driving patterns in conservation of bats on these farms? Next slide, please. What I found was that farms that had higher crop diversity also had higher bat abundance. So on the left here, you can see that bat activity is going up with crop diversity. We also found that on farms with higher crop diversity, there was more moth biomass. So what we're seeing is crop diversity providing stable, healthy populations of insects for bats to forage on, and then bats responding to this improved foraging quality. Next slide, please. So to sort of sum up the section on biodiversity conservation and how diversification structures ecological communities, we found that agroforestry can mitigate the negative impacts of agriculture on bats. woodlands and farms have distinct bat communities, and crop diversity can improve bat foraging. Now let's move on to the next section of the talk. Next slide, please. So how do local and landscape practices impact wildlife health? Most of the evidence for the effectiveness of using diversification practices to support biodiversity comes from documenting species on farms, rather than understanding underlying physiological states that ultimately determine population growth or decline over the long term. So in the next section, we'll focus on the individual level impacts to understand long-term population trends. My research asks if species presence equates to persistence, focusing on birds in California strawberry systems. Next slide, please. So here's the Central Coast again. You guys are going to be experts by the end of this talk. In this system, we looked at 21 different organic strawberry farms. And you can see the colors here indicate a landscape gradient. So within a kilometer of the farms, some of the surrounding landscapes had very little semi-natural habitat, whereas others had upwards of 60%. And this region has a lot of strawberry production. In the Central Coast, 43% of strawberries in the U.S. Are produced right here. So there are a lot of strawberry farms to choose from. Next slide, please. So we've talked about sort of species richness and diversity in communities, but these kinds of assessments could be misleading. They might be overly optimistic. So for example, farms could be ecological traps where species are attracted to what they think is high quality habitat, but actually it has a negative impact on their fitness. So on the left, if birds substitute strawberries for other diet items, they might be consuming a super high sugar diet, and that could have a negative impact on health and reproduction. So maybe strawberries are like the Cheetos of the bird world here. Another thing that could be going on is that farms could be attracting high numbers of birds, leading to negative density-dependent effects, such as crowding, so all the birds think it's great habitat and they all show up, or predation. So these kinds of habitats might also invite higher order predators. Next slide, please. So to understand the effects of diversification on avian health, we used a combination of metrics as health proxies. So we set up mist nets at on farms at field edges, and we extracted birds from them. And then to process the birds to get at these different health metrics, we weighed them, so we know their body mass. And then also, what's going on in that third picture is I'm taking a blood sample from a bird. And from the blood samples, we can prepare a blood smear on a glass slide and actually look at what's going on with their immune response. So in the picture on the right, those little dots are red blood cells, and the bigger pink splotches are white blood cells. So by counting different types of white blood cells, we can understand if a bird is having an immune response and if it's more or less stressed. So next slide, what did we find? We found that birds tended to have higher stress on diversified farms with little surrounding semi-natural habitat. So these two different colors indicate red is diversified farms, blue is farms with lower diversity, like a monoculture. And so the pattern that we notice here is that diversification is associated with higher stress in complex landscapes. But in landscapes that don't have a lot of semi-natural habitat, stress decreases as semi-natural habitat increases. Maybe animation ruins the rest of the slide. What happens if you advance once? Nope. Okay. Well, there was another graph that shows the same trend for body condition. So the takeaway from this, the pattern that we seem to be seeing here is that diversification benefits bird health if the farms are diversified or when habitat around farms is conserved. But when you have diversification on a farm and in the landscape, that's where we're seeing birds that seem to be a little bit more stressed and in worse condition. So we try to understand what's going on here. And it could be negative density dependent effects. We found some evidence that as diversification increased, so did bird abundance. So this might support that crowding hypothesis. We found that there were more song sparrows as local diversification increased, and then we found that there were more Oregon juncos as natural habitat around farms increased. So it might be an effect at the community level where certain species are responding to local drivers and others are responding to the landscape. Next slide, please. So we found that birds had lower stress on diversified farms or in landscapes with more conserved habitat. Birds on diversified farms and landscapes with more semi-natural habitat were more stressed. So what this means is local diversification practices may not have the same effect across different landscapes. So it's important to consider those local and landscape interactions. Next slide, please. In the first two sections of the talk, I focused on supporting biodiversity, but promoting biodiversity in agriculture is associated with both costs and benefits to humans. Diversified production systems could also promote species that threaten farmer livelihoods by consuming crops or beneficial and harming livestock. Oh, I guess I cut out there for a bit. So some birds are viewed as pests and vectors of foodborne pathogens in farmlands. Yet birds also benefit growers by consuming pests. And many growers seek to exclude birds from farms, but few studies ask how the functional role of birds shifts across farms. Here, we want to look at the net effects of birds, which is rarely quantified because it's hard to take a look at tritrophic interactions between birds and insects and crops. So this diagram, next slide, please. The diagram that is coming up represents the four main pathways by which birds would affect strawberry production. They might consume crops like an American robin. They could consume insect pests like a lygus bug, or they could consume beneficial insects like a big-eyed bug here, engaging in intraguild predation. And then the last pathway, part you guys have all been waiting for, is the fecal contamination. So birds could directly defecate on crops. And in that case, buyers are often required to refrain from harvesting produce that's within a given distance of fecal contamination and to take action to ensure or eliminate birds on their farms, which is near impossible because you cannot fence them out. So birds will be on farms, and it's more a matter of how we can make sure that the net effects are as positive as possible. Next slide, please. And now we will talk about what we can learn from fecal samples. So we collected almost 1,300 samples from 58 different bird species on farms using MISNETs. We used PCR to assay for strawberries and foodborne pathogens. So we looked for Salmonella, Campylobacter, and pathogenic E. coli. So these are three prominent foodborne pathogens. Again, we collected these samples from misnetting birds, and then we had them waiting in clean cotton bags. And most of the time, they would be so generous as to leave us a fecal sample, which we then sent to collaborators for sequencing. Next slide, please. We also used transect surveys to answer questions about berry damage and fecal contamination. So on 20 farms, we did 3 transects on each farm. And the transects allowed us to really get a good idea of berry damage because you can see evidence of birds consuming berries even if damaged berries have been removed. So on that bottom left, you can see bits of strawberry fruit that are scattered across the plastic tarp. And they will stick there and remain long after that damaged berry that's been picked out by a bird has been removed. Next slide, please. So we found that birds were less likely to damage strawberries in areas where there was more natural habitat around farms. So it could be that in these sort of landscapes that are intensive agriculture, where there's more damage, strawberry eating birds might spend more time foraging on farms compared to natural habitat. Or maybe there are just more strawberry eating birds in these kinds of landscapes. Here you can see a house finch looking pretty guilty with strawberry seeds stuck to its bill. Next slide, please. So we also looked at the effects by understanding if birds had eaten strawberry from fecal samples. And what we found was the same sort of trend, because we found that in landscapes with higher crop diversity, so more different types of crops on other farms around in the landscape, that sort of trend was intensified. So as there was more semi-natural habitat around the farms and more crop diversity, birds were less likely to damage berries. That being said, about half of the birds that we sampled did eat berries. Here you can see 3 different house finches all looking pretty guilty with strawberry stuck to their bills, and they were the species that were most likely to consume strawberries in the study. Next slide, please. We also looked at pest control and pest control disruption. We see these same sorts of trends where on farms and intensive landscapes, we have more of an ecosystem service. So we see more pest control in intensive landscapes on farms that are diversified. But we also see in those landscapes that birds are consuming more beneficial insects like natural enemies. Birds that are most likely to consume pests were barn swallows on the left, and most likely to consume natural enemies were brewer's blackbirds. So this really highlights the trade-offs. So if you're managing for one ecosystem service, like promoting pest control, you could also be increasing ecosystem disservices. So you might also be having birds eating more of those beneficial insects that you would want on your farm. So to understand if birds are really helping or harming strawberry production, we have to consider ecosystem services and disservices and look at these things together to get at net effects. Next slide, please. To do this, we set up a bird exclusion experiment. So on 15 farms, we had exclosure and control pairs. In the bird exclosures, you can see there's like a PVC pipe frame, and there's agricultural netting over the top of it, so birds do not have access to those berries. And then there's a control plot nearby that's just sort of the same size, but birds can get in there and either damage berries or consume insects. We scored berries from these plots for bird damage and damage from other kinds of insects or arthropods like slugs and lygus bugs. We scored over 10,000 berries to understand the net effects of birds. Next slide, please. In this graph on the left, we're looking at bird services and disservices, so the net effects on strawberries. And what we see is that it changes with the distance from the farm edge for farms in simple landscapes, which are shown in red, and in complex landscapes shown in blue. In simple landscapes with little surrounding natural habitat, birds are pests at farm edges, but they're beneficial in field centers. And we can see that by looking at these sort of heat maps on the right. The 2 different landscape contexts are shown. So a simple landscape on top has very little semi-natural habitat around the farm. And then what you see in those landscapes, the different colors represent how birds are impacting crops. So red means they're causing damage at edges, and blue means that they're helping strawberry production, mostly by providing pest control. On the bottom, you can see a farm in a complex landscape. You don't really see changes across the farm. So birds have a slightly negative effect, but they don't, the natural habitat is mitigating some of those more extreme damages and benefits that you would see in a more intensive agricultural landscape. Next slide, please. So it might be easier to think about what happens if you were to switch the landscapes surrounding these farms. So if the farm in the simple landscape all of a sudden had semi-natural habitat, we would see a decrease in costs by 23%. Similarly, If we took away the habitat from the farm and the complex landscape, we'd see an increase in cost by 76%. So this really demonstrates the protective effect of semi-natural habitat. Next slide, please. So we can talk about what might be going on in these different landscapes. In the complex landscape, there might be strawberry damage that's infrequent because other food's available. Maybe natural enemies are more abundant, and they're larger prey items, so a bird would probably prefer to eat them. They are more energetically profitable. Or it could just be that bird communities include different species that prefer natural enemy prey. In simple landscapes, in the centers, we see aerial insectivores like a barn swallow depredating on pests. There aren't really too many natural enemies in this landscape, but if there are any natural enemies, they're at field edges. So the birds that might be hanging out at the edge of the farm could be damaging strawberries and consuming natural enemies. Next slide, please. The final pathway that we wanted to look at was fecal contamination. And we did not see any effects of local or landscape diversification on fecal density in crop fields. So on these transects, we were just counting the number of bird feces. And what we did find is that farms that had more fencing and wires tended to have more fecal contamination. And that is most likely because birds will perch on fences and wires, and a lot of them are central place foragers. So they might sit on the fence, swoop down to grab an insect or maybe a strawberry, something to eat. And in the process of hanging out between fence and foraging, they're more likely to defecate nearby. Next slide, please. So even though we did find fecal contamination in crop fields, only 2 out of almost 20,000 berries that we looked at across the transects and exclosures had direct fecal contamination. So it's not much, but still to assess how much of a risk birds do present to strawberry production, we have to look at pathogen incidence. Next slide, please. We found very low rates of pathogen incidence, comparable to other studies in California. We found pathogenic E. coli in just 2 of the birds that we sampled. We did not find any salmonella in birds. And then we found about 3.5% of the samples, those birds were reservoir hosts for Campylobacter species. And the American goldfinch was the bird that was most likely to have a higher pathogen prevalence. Like with many of the other graphs that I showed you, we found that the probability of detecting Campylobacter went down when landscapes had more semi-natural habitat. So here again, we're seeing that having more natural habitat, more conserved habitat in the landscape is helping to mitigate disservices. Next slide, please. So we also need to think about how these ecosystem services co-vary. These are the 4 main pathways that we looked at. So we looked at birds damaging berries. We saw that they were less likely to do that in areas with more semi-natural habitat. We also saw the same trends for pest control and disrupting pest control and pathogen prevalence. So ecosystem services and disservices were less likely in landscapes that had more conserved habitat. This highlights that managing for one service could result in trade-offs in other services. So better outcomes can be achieved by considering suites of ecosystem functions so that trade-offs can be minimized. Next slide, please. So to sum up the talk, which I tried to make brief because I appreciate you guys sticking around and starting later with me. In the first half of the talk, we really focused more on conservation and farmlands. We found that there were different communities and diversity between farms and woodlands, so that's in California. We found that agroforestry can mitigate the negative impacts of agriculture on bats, while crop diversity can improve bat foraging quality. We also saw with the bird stress study that local diversification was associated with birds in better condition in simple landscapes, but not in complex landscapes. So in recent years, there's been a lot of market pressure that has encouraged farmers to remove non-crop vegetation in an effort to exclude wildlife from farms and mitigate food safety risks. Our results suggest that habitat conservation does not increase pathogen prevalence or fecal contamination, and it could even exacerbate crop damage. So taken together, our findings suggest that conserving natural habitat in farming landscapes may help to limit the role of birds as both pests and pathogen reservoirs on farms. However, conserving habitat may also be associated with pest control trade-offs when diversified farms are in landscapes with high amounts of semi-natural habitat. Next slide, please. That is it for today. I just want to thank all of the growers who hosted this research, field assistants, funders, and you guys for tuning in today. And with that, I will take any questions. Okay, first question. What are the major pests and natural enemies in California strawberries? And do these differ at all between diversified versus monoculture farms? Yeah, so the main pests, one of the main pests that I focused on was lygus. There are several pests. Another one is spotted wing Drosophila. One of the main natural enemies is big-eyed bugs. And I don't know so much that there are different pests, and it can change year to year. You know, certain years it's like a bad pest year for one type of pest, but not another. But I do see growers managing in different ways for pests, regardless of which species. So on a diversified farm, growers are, and I'm definitely generalizing, but many growers that have diversified farms are pretty in tune with which insect populations are surging and if pest populations are heading towards an outbreak. And so they are often not applying pesticides. If they do, they're applying organic pesticides, but they might be waiting until there's sort of some tipping point. Even in strawberry monocultures that are organic, when you have just tons and tons of strawberry forever and ever, those are landscapes that are more likely to have pest outbreaks. There may not be as many natural enemies sort of like waiting in the wings. So those growers might be more likely to take action sooner because they're not as worried about decimating populations of natural enemies. Let's see, next question. Recommendations changed due to my findings. When I first went into the Strawberry Bird Project, a lot of growers talked about the damage birds cause to berries because it's super easy to see. It's easy to see a bird eating a giant strawberry. It's less easy to observe pest control benefits or even pest control disruption. So I guess when I went into this, I was thinking that sort of the focal point of the study was how to prevent birds from eating strawberries, whereas it turns out insects cause way more damage than birds do. So I guess my ideas about this system have shifted in that sometimes there are these indirect or less visible effects that are really important, and it's important to highlight them. So that is one of the things that I do say when I talk to growers, is emphasizing how birds really don't damage many strawberries. In our study, they were responsible for 3% of berry damage, whereas insects were responsible for about a third of berries were damaged by insects. As far as discussing our work with policymakers, yeah, it's really important that we continue to build on evidence for food safety standards to guide those standards, because so much of the initial reaction to having outbreaks traced to the Central Coast was just get rid of all the habitat, get rid of all the wildlife. And we now know there's building evidence that removing habitat can have the opposite effect and can increase pathogen prevalence in the landscape. What about the practice of removing natural features for food safety and security? Could you elaborate on that question? We do have a lot of that still going on, and maybe You can tell me what you mean, but a lot of that pressure is actually coming from buyers. So if you are a grower and you want to sell your, do you think perspectives are changing? Yeah, I see. If you want to sell your produce, you have a contract with the buyer, and even though maybe technically you're allowed to have a hedgerow on your farm, that particular buyer may not allow it because they feel it's too risky. There were a lot of major reactions in the beginning where there were sort of stricter regulations about this. So I don't think that there's the same widespread habitat removal that there once was, and maybe that's because it's all been removed. But I do think that this is still going on. I interviewed growers in the past couple of years and just put together a synthesis paper on this, and it's not a problem that has gone away. Folks are still concerned that having habitat around could increase food safety risks. So I do think perspectives are starting to shift as evidence builds, but it's important to continue to have more evidence-based management for food safety and to really understand which species are potentially transmitting pathogens and how we can manage them to either have lower pathogen prevalence or to have less contact with crops. These are great questions. Does anybody have anything else? You can also email me if you would like, but any other burning questions about birds, bats, strawberries, fecal samples? Okay, well with that, I'll say thanks so much. You guys were a great audience, and fun times doing everything remotely. Thanks for your patience.